Dr. Paul Sachs is an infectious diseases specialist at Brigham and Women's Hospital. He joins us now here on CBSN Boston to expand on today's development because people have so many questions. Dr. Sachs, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me today. For people who recently received the J&J vaccine, what symptoms should they be watching for very closely?
First thing I have to mention, and it's already been mentioned, this is an incredibly rare side effect. And as mentioned, it happened in six women out of over 6 million doses received. So very uncommon, but nonetheless, to be cautious, if within the first couple of weeks after getting the vaccine, a person experiences, say, severe abdominal pain or headache or swollen legs, and they should definitely bring these symptoms to the attention of their physicians and mention that they got the J&J vaccine.
And you're absolutely correct, Dr. Sachs. We're talking about 6 out of 6.8 million at this point, so we want to make sure we put this in the proper perspective for people. And this happened predominantly in women 18 to 48. So you mentioned the symptoms to look out for. About how long do you think people should monitor for possible symptoms?
Well, it does appear to be a recent vaccine onset side effect. And so this is the cases occurred in the United States, at least within the first couple of weeks. It's very similar to what's been reported with the AstraZeneca vaccine that also these clots did occur relatively soon after administration of the vaccine. So I would say people who received the J&J vaccine a couple of months ago no longer need to worry. As far as we know, the risks are not elevated when it's that far removed.
We should say there are a lot of various medications, things that can cause an increase in the potential for blood clots, right? What is the treatment like if you do develop a blood clot?
The treatment for blood clots is to give blood thinners. And one of the important points made by the FDA by Dr. Marks, and he's actually a trained hematologist. He actually trained here in Boston. But one of the points he made is that one of the usual treatments for blood clots, which is heparin, the blood thinner, actually should not be administered to people who have this particular syndrome, because this syndrome does have very similar characteristics to one that is actually caused by heparin. So in this particular syndrome, if people do get these blood clots after the J&J vaccine, it will be a different treatment than the one given usually. And so that's why it's important to notify doctors that you've recently received this vaccine.
Interesting. We thought it was important to note also, just moments ago, the White House COVID response coordinator pointed out that this pause will not completely throw off the country's vaccine rollout because the Johnson & Johnson vaccine only makes up less than 5% of the entire vaccine supply. So can you put this into some perspective for us, what a pause means, as opposed to obviously pulling it completely off the market?
Well, the good news is that we now have plenty of vaccines, which is really exciting. We have these 2 other extremely effective vaccines, the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine. The production of those vaccines has ramped up substantially so that by all estimates, we are going to have sufficient vaccines, even with this pause on the J&J vaccine. So that's good news, number one. And good news, number 2, is that this pause will allow the safety officials to get more information and to see just how widespread this problem is, and then make a decision about whether to go forward. I suspect they will make the decision to go forward once they have a full accounting of the problem, but we don't know. And I think it's really kind of reassuring that with these new vaccines, they're under such a close microscope of attention for all their safety issues that something this rare could be picked up. So it's, in some ways, the system is working as it should.
Sure, they're out there, of course, because of emergency use authorization, because we are in such an emergency with COVID-19. But of course, these are the kinds of issues that would crop up, right, normally in a clinical trial.
Yeah, absolutely. A clinical trial had 20,000 people or so who got the vaccine. We're talking now already, since the clinical trial ended, of nearly 7 million people in the United States have received the J&J vaccine. So that can actually bring out safety issues that are much less common than would normally be picked up in a clinical trial. I do want to say that there is a history of this kind of pause before. There's a vaccine very commonly given to babies called the rotavirus vaccine that prevents diarrhea, and it's really effective. There was a brief pause with that vaccine also after it was rolled out into clinical practice, just to make sure that some of the observed side effects were not actually outweighing the benefits of the vaccine. And ultimately, it was decided that that vaccine is way more effective in preventing a severe and common illness than the side effects that people were concerned about.
Certainly, and people might be reading a lot about what happened in 1955 with one particular disaster during the polio vaccine rollout. And people were so terrified about polio, they still had their child get that vaccine, correct?
Correct. And really, I want to underscore, these vaccines are our pathway out of this pandemic, and they are remarkably effective. And the good news is, as I mentioned, we still have two very effective vaccines at our disposal, one made by Pfizer, one made by Moderna, and we just have to wait and see what the further investigation on this safety issue with J&J will reveal.